In Things Fall Apart, a novel about colonialism by a child of a missionary who did not like colonialism or Christianity very much, one of the main characters, Okonkwo, eventually commits suicide, unable to live with the new worldview, the new religion, the new system which has replaced him. He is thrown onto the trash heap of history. He gets replaced, gotten rid of by the universe, by the way things are in the world. And it can be easy to feel, if you are a Western traditionalist, that this African traditionalist, this person who held on to the beliefs of his ancestors, is an emblem, a symbol of you, of what your future will be, for holding on to your beliefs when the universe seems to be moving in another direction. It's easy enough to view the world through Marx's idea of the eye at the end of history, watching and looking and seeing things gradually moving in one direction. Or that angel in that one tragic poem who is always looking backwards while its wings are forced open and it's always pushed forward but cannot see what's happening as debris follows it backwards. It's easy enough to believe that the world goes in one direction. It's especially easy to believe that if you don't actually know history, if you only see history through hindsight, history which is manipulated, history which is edited, so that you only see one direction in history, so that you see only the good of the Enlightenment and not that it created not just liberalism but fascism and communism. When you see only the good of a large government and not the historic way in which people don't help others as much, don't engage in charity as much, aren't as moral as ordinary citizens as when government did not take over certain roles. It's easy to see a march towards a better future when you ignore the downsides of technology, when you ignore China's social credit system, or when you view things in a specific way. It's easy enough to believe that there's a march forward in one direction, but that march is not happening. You see one country introduces a certain set of rights, a certain ideology, another one rejects it. And it might be a very powerful country which introduces certain beliefs, certain strange beliefs. You have Chesterton's example of people going after people who claim that grass is green or the sky is blue, or that a triangle is a three-sided shape. And quite famously, there's been a recent example where James Lindsay argued that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and got a lot of people shouting at him and saying it can also equal 5 or any other numbers, because to them that's something which they are prepared to fight for and die for. It's a belief system which they have developed. And we also find all sorts of other belief systems. We actually find a view of science, that science is this ideology, is this voice, is this person, when science is simply a method. It simply consists of observing and reporting what seems to consistently be the case. When your certain experiment for gravity of dropping an apple, for instance, onto the ground, always has the apple dropping onto the ground, likely at around about the same speed, you might conclude that there's something called gravity. It's a process. It's not an ideology. It's not an intelligence of itself. It's not a voice of science. And when you have a voice of science which wants to cancel out other voices, you no longer have science. You don't have that voice. Now, to move away from ideas like that, though the idea of science being a voice of progress is something you need to be aware of, and it's danger to us. But that's not always the case. That's not how everyone views the world. I always find it quite fascinating to listen to people who believe in the type of logic of Eastern Europe, in a more symbolic type of way of looking at the world, rather than the strict logical way we get from our Thomistic sort of worldview in the West. And it doesn't give the same results as you get in the West. It gives different results. And you don't always see the interaction of just one type of worldview. We often think symbolically without realizing it. We also often think logically without realizing it. Logic of itself is based on the idea of cause and effect. every effect must have a cause, but we know that there must be a first cause which had no cause of itself. And so logic in that sense is simply an observation of a general trend, of a general thing which is usually the truth. But the world's more mysterious than that. We can't really predict what tomorrow will hold. We can't predict what direction things will be going in tomorrow. We might think this politician who came out of nowhere and fixed so many things for several years is suddenly possibly deposed of him. Maybe not, who knows? And this movement in this one direction, which seemed to be a charge towards things going right again, is suddenly halted. But we didn't expect that charge in the first place. We didn't expect that politician in the first place. We didn't expect those moments of courage which led us to where we are. We didn't expect the miracles which often happen in the last minute, for the simple reason that history is not just cause and effect. There's something else to it. Tolkien, for instance, creates this idea in his Silmarillion that the world is not simply movement from the beginning when Iluvatar creates the world. It also has this sense that Iluvatar in different ages and in different times also introduces more things into the world. There's this idea that you either believe that there's no miracles in the world or that everything's a miracle, that you can either view the world as set in stone in one direction, though very few people can predict the future and be correct about it. And we know that from looking into the past. Or you can view the world as consistently unexpected, that you can predict certain things with the basic knowledge of economics or politics or other such things. But most things you cannot predict. And those things on the edge, on the outside, are the things which have the greatest effect on the world. The challenges we face today, our ancestors could not imagine, including the challenges from bad ideology and from people who follow religions that they don't acknowledge they follow, while in fact following them. As Chesterton said, everyone is dogmatic, some of them admit it, and those are probably the ones who are more prepared to debate things, and others just consider their ideology to be the truth and not something to be debated, and that's where danger lies most of all. But this idea that when certain gains are gained by the other side, that we can't reverse those gains, that's just not true. And if it were not the case, that it's not true, they wouldn't fight so hard to prevent those gains from being lost. We can always move things in another direction. You can always reform institutions and move them back towards the direction you want them to be in. Imagine telling people 100 years ago how bad certain institutions are, how much they've fallen to a long march through them. People wouldn't believe it, and yet it's happened, which means that the opposite can happen as well. And the moment that you subject yourself to this fatalism, to this idea that everything is inevitable, rather than a view of the world that sees the world as a mixture of that which is mortal in the theological sense, that which is timeless in the theological sense of that which is bound by cause and effect, versus that which is eternal in the theological sense, or that which is bound by choice, human choice, or whatever other mysterious beings might exist in the world. But if you look at that combination, that fits history much better than the former. That fits a history where things happen very unusually, where the Spanish Armada gets blown away by winds, where there's a great victory against the Muslim empires coming into Europe, which is unexpected, where things happen in a way that you don't predict, where the Vikings come into England and Ireland and they're these terrible people who commit all sorts of crimes, and then they convert to Christianity and integrate into Europe and become part of Europe. So much so that many of us likely, I don't know, I've never done 22andMe, but likely many of us have some Norse DNA, some Northman DNA that we don't know about. And in England, a Norman king, the Duke of Normandy, became the King of England, became William the Conqueror. So if we view the world and we think that everything is this black and white, and we ignore all of the colours in between, and we ignore even the colours that we can't see because our eyes are not designed to see them, and we ignore that the world is always fluid and always in flux, then we're in danger of something far worse. We're in danger of closing our eyes to the world through despair, when the world we see is not true at all.